performance management and appraisal. Performance appraisal is what I'll usually say. Performance appraisals are used by almost every organization. Most managers don't like it. Most employees do want feedback. If you look at the whole system, just about everybody's dissatisfied with it typically. The raters or evaluators don't like doing it. I just said that. The ratees don't particularly like how they're rated. The administrators would like to have better data or more data. So it's just one of those things that in organizations that people think they have to do them, but it really ought to be thought through. It ought to be done well if you're going to do it. So it's a love it or leave it type situation. There are enormous legal grounds for doing performance appraisal, and that's expanding. You have to be able to. You have to tell people how they're doing before you can fire them or lay them off. The prescriptions for doing effective performance management are defining measurement, defining what you're measuring, the job performance, deriving that content from some valid means, particularly internal and external customer requirements and evaluations. Deriving the ratings from multiple sources is a good thing to do. And then correct for all of the errors and situational constraints that you find in performance appraisal. The last thing, just as an intro, is performance appraisal really should be a continuous process. It should be something that's every day. You're coaching, you're telling people what to do, you're delegating, but then periodically, once or twice a year, you're giving a formal written appraisal. So it should be an ongoing process with all the pieces fitting together. Performance is really the record of outcomes produced on any specific job or a function in a job over a specified time period. That's really what we're talking about when we talk about performance appraisal. Performance is equal to the sum of all the performances across all the job functions. You can read that stuff in the book, but it really is a sense of skills and knowledge and competencies and performance of tasks. So there are different things you evaluate on. Most people evaluate on tasks. Some evaluate on outcomes. Other people evaluate on competencies, the skills and abilities and knowledges. And some people do a mix of all those. So the first thing you think about is what are you measuring? And there are lots of possibilities here. The other is what are the uses of the data? You can use it for internal staffing, promotions, and terminations. You can use it for training needs analysis. You can do it for research, obviously, to collect data and to do validation of things. You can do it to make decisions about people, either pay or layoffs or firing, discipline type things. The legal issues have to be cared for or dealt with. Charges of unfairness or bias can result from decisions made from performance appraisal data, and it is essentially the same as everything else we've looked at through this book. Equal employment law applies to all decisions, and performance appraisal is the basis for decisions on pay and discipline and firing. And so there's a figure in your book that lists the performance appraisal characteristics that are related to the content and the process and the results, and you need to look at that. Anyway, violation of the 80% rule, the 4/5 rule, in any decision that's made from performance appraisal works just like a selection decision. Any kind of treating somebody differently or any kind of disparate impact kicks in the same problems, and you have to prove that what you did is valid and isn't related to race, color, sex, religion, and national origin. And in performance appraisal, that's basically showing that you did analyze the job, you know what it is, you have a measure that's valid of how well someone has done that performance or achieved those outcomes, and that you're actually measuring performance on the job and not something else. And so you're focusing on validity, just like in selection. You should conduct audits of your performance appraisal system periodically, because performance appraisal systems tend to go bad if they're not attended to. People don't like doing them. They cheat, and if you're on a 5-point scale and 5 is good and 1 is bad, and you know in your heart that someone's a 2, and you have to sit down with them and give them a verbal feedback on what your ratings are, it's a lot easier to give that person a 3 than it is a 2. If there's nothing tied to it, like big pay raises or something else. Whenever you have to face and give feedback to the employee, we tend to get leniency, which is an error, which is higher scores. We'll talk about that in a bit. In designing an appraisal system, you, of course, want to look at the focus. And it's like work analysis. Is the focus person-oriented, or is it task-oriented, work-oriented? Or does it focus on a record of outcomes, or does it focus on achieving goals? And so you can measure goals, you can measure outcomes, you can measure the person, whether they have competencies and skills, or you can measure the work. Did the tasks get done? Every one of those essentially ends up with a different kind of design in a performance appraisal system. There are 6 categories of performance outcomes. You can look at the text about that: quality, quantity, timeliness, cost effectiveness, need for supervision, interpersonal impact, or citizenship performance, something like that. The closer you are to outcome or to actual work tasks, the more precise your measurement is probably going to be. The problem with measuring outcomes in a performance appraisal system is that there are lots of jobs where the individual doesn't control all of the outcomes. They just do a little piece of the work, and it all adds up across different people to an outcome. And so if that's the case, it's unfair to measure one person on an outcome when they only contributed part of that outcome. And so that's why you see most people are judged on tasks rather than outcomes or goals. Executives, managers tend to be judged on goals. People that have a complete operation to do are usually judged on outcomes, like sales of a car or something like that. And then people that have pieces of the job, like on an assembly line, or they're just one of the people that intervenes with a patient in a hospital, then usually those folks are judged on tasks that they do. And so all of that kind of builds into how you design the system. The measurement process, it gets complex too, because you can rank people, which is simply putting them in order, or you can rate them on a 5-point scale or a 7-point scale or a 10-point scale. Ranking requires a much smaller number of people. If you have more than about 10 people, it's really hard to put people in a rank and make it meaningful, particularly if you have multiple dimensions. And that's another issue in the design. Ranking makes sense if it's just like if you want to rank your salespeople in car sales. It's easy to take 10 salespeople and count the number of cars they sold in a month and then rank order them by the highest number to the lowest number. But if your job is multidimensional, where there's a lot of different tasks to be done, in other words, people are doing quality improvement and they're doing IT improvement, they're doing cost improvement, and they're doing a set of tasks on their job, and et cetera, et cetera. All of a sudden, you've got a multidimensional operation that probably isn't as simple, has a simple one outcome measure, like selling a car. And so you're probably rating those people on multiple dimensions and then adding that up somehow. So you can either make comparisons among ratees' performance, and you can rank or rate to do that. You can compare among performance level anchors or standards, and when you read in your textbook and you look at behaviorally anchored scales, that's what that is. Or you can make comparison of people's performance within themselves over time, and so there are different things that you would do there too. I mean, obviously, the best thing to do is measure outcomes, but the problem is most people don't have a complete outcome. And then you fall down to tasks, and then the problem with tasks is you probably really can't rank most people. You're going to end up with rating, and then do you rate them against a standard, or do you rate them against what they did last year or the last rating period? And so all of those are decisions that get made in designing a system. You can see that these systems have a lot of logic to them, and you really have to think through, why are you doing the measurement? What are you going to measure? Who are you going to measure? Who's going to be doing the measurement? We haven't talked about those last two things. But if you just think about who can do the measurement, there are a number of people, and in some systems, and they're usually called 360-degree systems, they'll use all of the folks to do the measurement. You could have a supervisor measure, you can have the supervisor's supervisor measure the performance. You can have peers measure the performance, you can have a person's subordinates measure their performance, you can have customers measuring a person's performance. So there's a lot of people around the wheel that you can actually ask, and you can ask all of those people to judge performance. That obviously gets very time consuming and very difficult to collect all the data. Of course, computers make it easier. But the most common is supervisors who have the best opportunity to view or watch somebody do the work, do the judgment. You can also have self-ratings. I forgot that one, but people tend to either self-judge themselves too high or they self-judge themselves too low. Peers tend to scratch each other's backs. You give me a high rating, I'll give you a high rating. So friends rate friends high and enemies rate enemies low. Customers tend to not like to make judgments about people. And what happens there is that they tend to give high evaluations for people that they like or give good service, and give no evaluations for the people that they don't like. So all of these systems have flaws in them. Managers can be biased. They have in-groups and out-groups, and they tend to measure their in-groups better than or higher than their out-groups. If the manager is going to meet with you to give you feedback, then the manager tends to give higher ratings. And so every one of those systems has, or every one of those people doing evaluation produce different kinds of errors or have different kinds of biases. There's a large discussion about different kinds of rating scales, the discussion of graphic rating scales, which is just a plain vanilla rating scale, and behaviorally anchored rating scales. The author of your textbooks actually invented behaviorally anchored rating scales way back in the 70s. But behaviorally anchored rating scales are graphic scales with specific behavioral descriptions. Instead of saying a lot to some to a little bit, they're actually behaviorally defining points where Decker, when he lectures so that you can hear him, so you can't hear him. And that's not a good example, but you actually put behaviors in there to anchor this scale. There's another scale you need to pay attention to, and that's behavioral observation scales. And those are scales where a rater actually rates the frequency by how many times a ratee has performed a number of listed behaviors. The performance distribution assessment is another. It it statistically incorporates constraints on performance as a formal part of the measurement process. It's not used very much. Management by objectives is discussed, and that's a way of actually measuring whether a person meets their objectives or not. And so that's used only in high-level management jobs for the most part, where you're judging somebody only on the objectives that they've met. But that could be sales jobs too. The bottom line is that you have to pay attention to why you're doing it, what you're measuring, and why you chose that, who's doing the measurement, and the system that you're doing. Are you ranking or rating or using one of the more complex scales like a behaviorally anchored rating scale? And then after you get all that figured out, you have to start controlling for rating errors and bias. And some of these scales help you do that. But there are lots of basic errors that people make in doing evaluation. I've talked about leniency, and that's rating too high. Because you don't want to have to face an irate employee. Severity is the opposite. You rate people too severely, and you get that, like brand new instructors tend to give harder tests, and brand new managers tend to be fairly severe in their ratings. The halo effect is complex. It only occurs on multi-dimensional rating, and it is basically where a rater, me as the boss for instance, really wants one dimension. One dimension is very important to me, and if you do well on that dimension, I rate you across all the dimensions well. And if you do poorly on that dimension, I rate you on all of those dimensions poorly. The only way you can really find halo is to intercorrelate the rating matrix, and you can see there's intercorrelation between the ratings. And when you see that, it doesn't matter which direction it is, but when you see that, you know that you've got halo. Central tendency is another deliberate error. It is rating everybody in the middle, and that's, if you give people a 5-point scale, most people are very reluctant to use 1 and 5, and so almost everybody gets rated 3, 4, or 2, 3, and 4. And so you really got a 3-point scale rather than a 5-point scale. And remember, and I don't know if I've said this yet, the major reason that you do any kind of measurement or evaluation is to differentiate people, to put them in different piles. If I gave you a test on this course and everybody got an item correct, that item doesn't differentiate the people who know a lot about the chapter versus the people that know nothing about the chapter. So that item's worthless to me. I'd throw it out. So an item that everybody gets correct or everybody gets wrong doesn't help me differentiate people. So I only want items that spread people out across a distribution. And it's really the same in performance appraisal. If you give people a 5-point scale and they're only using 2, 3, and 4, and they refuse to use 1 and 5, you in essence have a 3-point scale. You can only put people in 3 piles, 2, 3, and 4. And then you spread it out and you give people a 7-point scale and they don't use the 1 or the 7, then you might end up with a 5-point scale. Most people, when they look at a scale, they decide who's bad and who's good and who's in the middle, and they'll start using 3 points in the scale anyway. So often, and you can try this, but often a 3-point scale is probably the best thing you're going to get. Even if you give people a 7-point scale, they're probably only using 2 and 4 and 6 maybe in that scale. And you can look at that statistically and see what your distribution is and what your frequencies are. And you can look for central tendency, you can look for leniency, you can look for the distribution and tell whether people are doing deliberate errors or not. It's very easy. But central tendency is simply the tendency to judge everybody in the middle. That's because you don't like to be harsh and you don't like to judge people to begin with, so you just make everybody a 3 and everybody's happy. Actually, the good people won't be happy, but it is a thing that people do. Representativeness is an error, and you see that in performance appraisals that occur once a year. What happens in the last 2 or 3 months? Everybody will clean up their act and do really good behavior, and the managers are all old guys like me, and they only remember what happened in the last 2 months if they're lucky. And so when I said sit down and do the evaluation, I'm judging you on the last 2 months, and you've had really good behavior, and so you get a high evaluation. But it is not representative of the 12 months of the evaluation. And so the best way to make a performance appraisal representative of those 12 months is to take notes. When bad things occur, good things occur, make a little note and throw it in a file. Then you can go back when you do the yearly or annual performance appraisal and look at your notes and say, oh, I had a lot of good and bad here. And it's not just the good stuff I saw in the last month. And so that's what representation is. Does that appraisal really represent the whole year? Availability is just a frequency of occurrence. If people don't make errors very often, they're not available. I mean, I can't see errors, so I give people high ratings. I can alter judgments in other way. Anchoring is one that's really insufficiently connecting a judgment to some 0 point or some anchor in some case. I judge every person on a different scale. That's lack of anchoring. A lot of this stuff can be cleared up in rater training, a lot of the unintentional errors. Of course, you're going to have intentional errors. I mean, if I hate somebody, I'm going to give them a bad rating, and you can't, it's hard to stop that. You can try to train that away, but that's really a motivational error. But rater training does work. You can train people to understand what halo is and severity and all of these different errors, and you'll find that the raters tend to commit fewer errors. You can also train raters to use different forms, like the behavioral anchored rating scale, and you get more valid ratings by doing so. There are some other discussions. There's a discussion of the productivity measurement and enhancement system, and you need to read that. There's a figure in your book that talks about the steps of that. It's a method to measure aggregated performance, and complex organizations tend to use that. So you should know what that is. Benchmarking is another, and that's gauging internal practices against external standards, and benchmarking is starting to come into performance appraisal. While a lot of big companies were doing 360 20 years ago, hospitals are starting to discover it. They'll start to discover benchmarking and some of these other more complex systems. All of these complex systems take a lot of expense to create, and they take a lot of time of the manager to actually do. And so you have to have a large workforce or a large diverse workforce, or you have to have performance appraisal be very critical in your organization to put that kind of expense and money into it. And you're starting to see hospitals grow in size, getting to be larger systems, and you're starting to see performance appraisal be fairly important as far as the strategy of the organization goes. What people do will drive your HCAP scores and drive your quality and cost control efforts, and so performance appraisal will become more important in an organization, and you'll see them spend more time and more effort doing it correctly. Methods of delivering performance feedback, there's a discussion of that. That's basically sitting down with an employee and giving them feedback about their performance. That's usually done annually. It's usually done when a written performance appraisal is done. That's a highly motivational situation. I think in your course there are a set of key behaviors for actually doing a sit-down evaluation. The major issue there is to just make sure you don't create or commit rater errors because you are sitting down. It also means that you probably should have written notes for what happened across the year. Because if you walk in and say that you've done poorly on X, Y, and Z, and you don't have evidence of that, the employee is going to argue, and all you've got is an argument. Where if you had written notes, you can say, well, on such and such a date this happened, and such a date this happened, and it becomes a lot easier to give effective feedback when you've got notes. And so knowing what the job is, and knowing and being representative across the job and across the review period for the behavior, and having written notes of what happened, are very, very important elements to sitting down and having a performance interview with an employee. Avoid being disturbed, and have sufficient time, and be relaxed, and include praise. I mean, a lot of times performance appraisal can get fairly negative. Don't forget that employees did really good things too. And so consider everything I've said so far, and almost do an interview guide like the last chapter, and write down the steps you should do and the key behaviors for giving an appraisal interview. Make sure you've got notes and all of that. So to sum it up, performance appraisal is a relatively important tool in an organization's life. People need feedback. Organizations need data about people to make decisions about them, and that's the job of performance appraisal. Obviously, it has to be valid. It has to be based on work analysis and really represent the job. The method has to be valid. It has to be fair and error-free, and not a lot of bias in it, which means managers have to be trained, and you should have a format that helps them do an unbiased job of doing performance appraisal. They should be trained. They should be trained to do this all year, keep notes, do coaching, and all of that. If you're going to make decisions about people on performance appraisal, you basically need to do it well. Hospital organizations have to keep information about competencies of people. Sometimes that's built into performance appraisal, sometimes it's not. Competencies are different than performance appraisal. A competency is something that causes good performance. And it can be a trait, it can be a skill, it can be a piece of knowledge, it could be wearing a red tie. If that caused good performance, then it's a competency. And it's something usually that can be learned or acquired in some way. And hospitals are required to maintain the competence of their workforce and measure that competence. So there's a lot of training around competencies. There's competence assessment, which may be totally different from performance appraisal, or it may be blended together. My feeling is that it should be blended together where you can do it. But there are, again, lots of situations where it makes more sense to evaluate a person on the actual task being done than the competencies. Then obviously there are people that are independent contractors, and you don't really have the right to assess their tasks or their competencies. You're paying them to do a performance. And it doesn't matter how they do that as long as it's to what maintains the law. And so you're going to measure outcomes there. So it gets complex. Are you measuring outcomes or competencies or tasks? Competency measurement in most hospitals is a separate system, and it's because Joint Commission requires it. Some licensing organizations now require competence assessment, but basically your people need to be competent. They need to be able to do the job. But competencies are usually a larger thing, like am I competent as a teacher, as an instructor? Am I competent in choosing textbooks? Am I competent in making tests? Those are competencies that are much larger than tasks. To produce a test, it requires a number of different tasks, and so don't get too confused about competencies versus tasks. Nursing may have 10,000 tasks, but it has 5 or 6 competencies. I mean, nurses essentially assess the care, and they plan the care, and they deliver the care, and they evaluate whether they did the care, they document the care, etc. And then, of course, they have all the things that the organization wants. They cut costs, they increase quality, blah, blah, blah. And so, you probably find no more than about 20 competencies for a nurse. But if you went and looked at their skill checkoffs, they got books of them. They literally have thousands of different skills they have to be able to do. So those are two separate systems in most places. And they're both important. They're important to keep people competent, to keep people doing the job, to give the organization feedback, to give the individual feedback, etc. And it is a complex problem, and I'll sum it up one more time. You've got to figure out why you're doing it. You have to figure out what you're measuring. You have to figure out who's going to measure it. You have to figure out how they're going to measure it, what kinds of systems. You have to figure out the training that you're going to give those people. You're going to figure out when and how you're going to collect the information, and what are you going to do with it. And so it is a complex system, which takes a fair amount of thought. Now, I'm assuming that your HR officer is going to know all the details of how to do all this, but you just got the conceptual process of how it needs to be thought through. If you're going to do performance appraisal poorly, don't do it. It's a huge amount of work. Everybody's doing it. HR people are just consumed with it. You're collecting data everywhere. If you're not going to do it well, don't do it. I mean, just give people pay raises based on cost of living. The only reason that you would do performance appraisal is because you were either going to base pay on it, you are combining it with a competency system, which is required by Joint Commission, or you're going to make decisions about layoffs or discipline or firing people based on performance appraisal. Well, most people don't spend a ton of time firing people, and competency assessment is often a separate system. And if you don't have actual merit pay, then think twice about the complexity and the time spent on performance appraisal. Now, when I say actual merit pay, I mean really differential merit pay. If I have a 3% merit pool for the year, and everybody gets their performance scores, and we divvy out that 3% to all the employees, and I go back and I actually look at the differential in pay from last year to this pay, and virtually everybody in my organization got between 2.8 and 3.2% raises, and I spent all of that effort on a performance appraisal system to justify that. I probably just wasted $1 million or more. I could have just given a 3% across the board increase and been done with it, and saved enormous amount of manager time and HR time that could have been spent doing other productive things. So think that through when you do a performance appraisal system. That's it. Read the textbook. I'll see you next time.